Conversation was to be candid. And time now for our political panel to convene on some of those major stories of the day. Liberal MP James Stephens is here in Canberra and Labor's Josh Wilson is in Perth. I take it, Josh Wilson, by choice. What is it about West Australian MPs in 2022? You're still balking, I suppose, at quarantine on return. Is that why you're there?
Well, it's to do with the current settings. Greg, I came across to Parliament a number of times last year and quarantined for 2 weeks on return. The current settings require quarantine for the entire household, which doesn't work with my youngest just starting year 12. But like people all across Australia, you sort of roll with the punches and make the best of the circumstances, try and be as flexible as possible. And obviously I'll be participating by video link.
Does it seem even more dislocating, Josh Wilson, as you sit there in the West and hear the Prime Minister announcing today that borders from a federal point of view may fully reopen at the end of this month? Tourists can come in if they're fully vaccinated from wherever, and still you and your fellow sand gropers are in this situation, lockdown.
Well, we're not in lockdown. I mean, we've experienced fewer days of lockdown than anywhere else.
Yeah, not lockdown, but locked out, I suppose. Locked out to easy access by outsiders.
Yeah, I mean, look, border controls have been the key to managing the pandemic, and states and territories have applied different kinds of border measures all the way along. The Morrison government has been very selective in the way that it's approached these things. It's tended to have a go at states like Western Australia when we were applying measures exactly the same as in James' home state of South Australia. I think it just depends on the flavour of the Premier. But clearly, Australia-wide, within Australia and in relation to the wider world, we want to be opening up as soon as it's safe to do so. It's fantastic.
Does it make
for the
it
Prime
more
Minister
untenable for the West, Premier McGowan, to keep going with this course of action while potentially every other state and territory moves to unfettered international access?
Well, let's just see what unfettered international access means exactly. I mean, the current government has made announcements at various points about what's going to happen, and in many cases a disaster has ensued. So let's just see about the preparations that are put in place and whether or not the government can do things differently and actually make sure that if a change like that occurs, that it occurs safely, because the record so far has been one disaster after another with very, very significant health consequences and economic consequences that flow from that.
All right. Well, James Stephens, you have made it to Canberra out of South Australia, and when you hear that tourism can start coming back from the end of this month, what do you think that's going to mean? A slow build from a pretty low base right now?
No, look, I think, Greg, there's a lot of pent-up demand for people to come to Australia, and we look forward to welcoming them. Tourism companies, particularly those that rely on international travellers, have done it probably the toughest of any businesses out there, and it's been difficult but necessary to have those border restrictions in place. But I'm really proud to be a part of a government that has kept the faith and opened the border at the first safe opportunity to do so. You're right, it is a stark situation when people can come into Australia from London or New York, but not from Perth, and that I think is regrettable. We kept faith in my home state of South Australia. We said to people, get vaccinated. When you do that, your freedoms can start to be restored, and we kept that commitment. It's great to see the international border opening, and I look forward to the benefit of that, particularly to those tourism businesses that have been desperately waiting for foreign tourists to come back into our country.
And where do you expect the biggest resurgence will be? Queensland would be a reasonable pick, wouldn't it, over perhaps your home state of South Australia?
I hope people come to South Australia, of course, our beautiful wine regions and the like, but I think it is a safe bet that Queensland, in particular northern Queensland, places like Cairns that have very strong links into countries like Japan and other markets, it will be great to see those areas hard hit getting that surge shot in the arm from those foreign tourism dollars as soon as possible.
All right, and aged care defence troops going in. Back to you, first of all, James. 1,700, we just heard from the sector that they're welcoming it. Some people are describing it as modest. What appreciable difference do you think those forces will make?
Well, I think we're going to do everything we possibly can with our ADF support that we've announced, and I think it's an excellent start. As you say, the sector are welcoming it. The Prime Minister's comments and the Minister's comments are that this is something that's initial and it may well be expanded as is necessary. Of course, there's an enormous amount of pressure on the aged care workforce, and where we can use ADF resources to provide appropriate support, we should, and we've announced today that we will. And
Josh Wilson, is this reactive, do you think, in any way? And if so, is that a bad thing? Are governments meant to react when the demands come forward from an embattled sector like aged care?
Well, it's entirely reactive. I mean, aged care is in a terrible crisis. It was in a crisis before the pandemic, and it's been exacerbated by the pandemic and by the failures of the government to prepare for the kinds of things that we need. I mean, we've got half of aged care facilities in Australia, I think, managing outbreaks at the moment. We've got a workforce crisis. I know the Shadow Minister was referring to a centre the other day that had a nurse and 2 carers looking after 120 residents overnight, trying to help people out of soiled clothing and see that they're turned and answer their buzzers and all those things. Aged care is in a terrible way because of the dysfunction of this government, because of the incompetence of this government. And they do turn to the ADF. The ADF is an excellent organisation, and I'm sure they will do everything they can. But the Prime Minister himself has acknowledged that in an aged care environment, you need specialists. You need people who are trained nurses and aged care specific professionals. And we don't have that because of.
So you're not entirely convinced, Josh, that this is the right number and skill set that's needed in the sector right now?
Well, the Prime Minister's acknowledged that himself, and I think anyone who has a relative in aged care or who indeed lives and works in aged care knows that it is an area of highly skilled professionals who do the work vocationally. They're drawn to it because of their commitment to older Australians. Now, drawing on the ADF because of the crisis that the government itself has created is I guess, a kind of a band-aid measure, and any band-aid is probably welcome at this point. But the Prime Minister himself has acknowledged that ADF personnel are not the kind of trained personnel that we need when people aren't being changed. They're being left in soiled clothing overnight. They're not having wounds dressed. They're not being fed properly. They're getting sick, and in some cases they're dying.
Yeah. Josh, whichever way you cut it, these are 2 significant announcements that have come from the NSC today, aged care and border reopening. I'm sure there'll be cynics out there who think there's some coincidence in the fact that we got these significant announcements on the same day that Nationals had to mop up the remains of the text messaging exchange, the free character assessments, Barnaby Joyce on Scott Morrison. Are you one of those cynics?
Well, I don't think you have to be a cynic, and it's not just the disunity and the dishonesty in the government. It's the fact that there's an election not far away and they are in full-on panic mode. I mean, the item that you mentioned before about funding for our public broadcasters after 9 years of putting the boot into the ABC and the SBS, they now expect people to believe that they've done a 180-degree turn and that they somehow support those vital institutions. One of their characteristics is they literally think that they can take Australians for idiots. But the text fiasco doesn't change anything. Australians know that the Prime Minister is an unreliable character and that this government serves up dysfunction as the main course day after day, the disunity and dishonesty are just side dishes to that main course.
All right. Well, James Stephens, that does invite a response from a loyal member of Scott Morrison's government. I take it you're going to assure us that the Nationals are dealing with this and there's no correlation between the announcements we got today and any strife internally around honesty and the Prime Minister's character.
Well, of course there's not, Greg. Obviously, the National Security Committee meets regularly and it meets to discuss things related to the national security of our nation, the sorts of decisions like opening our border, not because they're motivated by other things that occur in the news cycle. Of course, we welcome these decisions being made on expert health advice. They're two very important decisions, and if anyone thinks that they shouldn't have been made today, if Labor don't support them, they can make that argument. I certainly support them. I'm proud that we've made these commitments, and it's good to see these sorts of milestones being reached, particularly when it comes to the international border, seeing us move on the other side of the pressures of the Omicron variant, and a good Morrison government making decisions in the interests of our economy and the safety of all Australians.
Are we able to agree, both of you, I'll start with you, Josh, that everyone in this building where I am and where James is, whether they be members of the media, staff or politicians, have probably written things in a text message that they sincerely wish they hadn't, or that all parties concerned had deleted? Would you count yourself among those, Josh Wilson?
Oh, I'm sure I've sent a text message here and there that I wish I'd composed better. The autocorrect
time to delete
is a great
them.
enemy.
Time to delete them then before they get out.
Oh no, I mean, I don't look. I don't want to make some sort of glib remark about what the text episode that we're seeing currently really represents. What it represents is very senior members of the government expressing a view about the Prime Minister that goes to the heart of his character and his competence. And what's worse, as I said before, it's not that actually this tells the Australian people something they didn't already know about Scott Morrison. What it tells you is that other members of the government, senior members of the government, like the Deputy Prime Minister, are very happy to just put those things to one side because all they want to do is look after themselves. That's what the heart of this matter is all about.
All right. James, just quickly, how's your vault of text messages past archived looking today?
Greg, I've got no doubt that there are things in my phone that if they were in the public domain, I may well be regretful of and embarrassed about. And I think any human being sitting at home watching your program right now would be in the same position. It's a regrettable situation. I'm pleased that Barnaby has apologised, and I think it speaks well to the Prime Minister's character that he's accepted that apology, and he's prepared to move on and stay focused on running the country.
All right, well, soon enough, Parliament's going to get down to some business, what business is left from a legislative point of view, and your government, James, seems at sixes and sevens over religious discrimination, whether, in fact, it can hold the ranks together on that. Are you a supporter of the changes, both sets of changes the Prime Minister wants to make?
Yes, I support the bill, and I support what the Prime Minister has discussed in enhancing the bill and improving it. Obviously, we've gone through a very thorough process of consulting on this because it's something that's extremely important, but also something that we need to bring the entire community along with us on. So we've held two separate inquiries that both reported at the end of last week. We've obviously been working on this for a number of years. The debate starts in earnest in the House tomorrow, and I hope by the end of the week we see the religious discrimination bill passed through the lower house.
Even if there were objectors to this in the coalition's ranks, Josh, that means floor crosses, basically. That wouldn't matter much if Labor came on board and supported the religious discrimination bill, will you?
Well, we'd have to know what we were coming on board. I mean, it's interesting that James says he supports it. As far as I understand, the coalition party room hasn't resolved its position on a number of amendments. Those amendments flow from the reviews that have occurred. So we don't know what we're dealing with, and I wouldn't be confident that something will come into the House because it's like cats in a bag. I mean, there's disunity everywhere you look. There are people doing radio interviews saying what they will and won't support from within the coalition, they have not settled their position. So
you're going to keep them guessing.
Impossible for,
you're going to keep them guessing until what? You've got a bead on which way the coalition's going.
Well, I think that's the. To support greater religious freedom, that it could in fact create new avenues of discrimination, either amongst people of faith, of different faiths, and also with respect to people of no faith, other parts of the community. Those are very, very real concerns. They emerged from the reviews. They haven't been addressed in terms of the amendments that the government has settled. So James talks about how you've got to take the community with you. The community has no idea. All they know is that various different members of the coalition are running out saying what they will and won't support.
Okay, and maybe it's just mathematical to do with the number of days remaining, James, but we've had it confirmed publicly today, no legislation to be brought forth for a corruption commission. There'll be many who are simply making the point, why? Why not? At least give it a go, even if time beats you.
Well, it is regrettable. I want to see us legislate a federal ICAC. I don't want a Liberal ICAC or a Labor ICAC. I want one that we all support, that has integrity, that's robust and that is respected. We've been undertaking a process and seeking to engage with people like the opposition on that. They've had no interest in sitting down and talking genuinely and sensibly with us about the model that we've proposed. And so regrettably, we're in the situation where close to an election, Labor are not interested in progressing this. They're playing politics with it, and the window has unfortunately closed. And I'm genuinely disappointed in that, because I do want to see us legislate a good, strong, robust federal ICAC.
Josh Wilson shaking your head. It might simply be a matter that a Labor government could attend to if you win the argument.
Well, we've committed to do that. And when people have spent the last 9 years, and particularly the last 3 years, seeing terrible dysfunctional government, there are a number of areas where there would be significant change. If there was a change of government, I think Australia deserves much better than they've had. One thing that we know people want is a federal integrity commission. We've said we'll deliver it. The government said they would. They've broken that promise, and it's daft to say that that's got anything to do with us. They've done nothing to advance it, and they don't want to.
All right, well, that one won't be on the agenda, but I'm sure other things will be bubbling away for you remotely, Josh Wilson, and for James Stephens in person here in Canberra. Thanks for joining us, both of you, on our panel today. Now,